tree, rearranging what was allowed. Mei Lin found herself thinking of the southern Etalia, girls humming under a slant of roof. The way her grandmother had shown her to fold a scrap of silk into a safe place under a sleeping pullet. She thought of the recipe fragment she had smuggled to the capital and the impossible blue it had given her when ground with rice and salt. That blue had made the emperor look up from a scroll. It had, for a heartbeat, brought a line of a poem back into his mouth. She had been praised silently by her own conscience for wielding that miracle. Now, Jiao's words salted that praise. "What did you expect of me?" Mei Lin asked. "That I should stop. That I should deny memory to the emperor and to those who relied on it." Jiao looked at her with the softness of someone who had buried more than bones. "I do not say the work is not worth the risk," he said. "I say we must reckon the cost. If every pot of color demands a life taken or a hillside ruined, then beauty becomes the instrument of violence. We are obliged to find another way if there is one." They spoke until the lamps guttered low. The confession opened a ledger of questions that had always been inked in Mei Lin's private book but left unread. Who feeds the craft? Who pays when beauty buys a harvest, and whether a painting could justify a ruined well? In the hush that followed, decisions settled like silt. The next morning, Mei Lin went to the docks. Marinaran was waiting under a sky mottled with gulls. He leaned against a crate that had once held tar, his hands dry and puckered like old rope. A handful of ore sat on the lid, a pale, heavier dust than Mei Lin remembered. He let some sift between his bruised fingers, and the granules shivered into the wind. "They come with less every year," he said, as if continuing a conversation begun on another shore. "Not enough to fill a kiln these days. The veins are throat-thin. Where there was black earth there is only the bones of pits. Men who go are not the same. They come back quiet." Mei Lin thought of the village photograph and of Jiao's bowl. "What did they trade for it?" she asked. "Promises," Marinaran replied. "Promises and a price fixed in a ledger. Some merchants took whole stretches of coast and called them concessions. The state never sees the hand that signs, only the paper. The men who worked the pits swallowed sea water in the dry months. They sold their plots to pay for medicine. Some of them left their daughters with kin and never returned." He told her of a cove where ferritic rock still gave a thin bloom of color, but only after a week of rain and at the cost of shunting a stream so boats could reach the seep. He spoke matter-of-factly, as if reciting rotes, but his eyes kept going to the horizon where the color of the sea had already thinned. "Is there not another source?" Mei Lin asked. The question rose like a prayer and felt unfit when said aloud. "There are pigments that come from plants and shells and fermented dyes," and said. "But they are subtle. They change with weather, with the soil. They are less reliable for a court that wants ceremony and show. They are cheaper, too, so the men who profit from scarcity do not much wish for them. The traders like a scarcity. It fattens the pockets of men who would not know beauty if it brushed their tongues." Mei Lin let the word cheaper roll against her teeth like a pebble. Cheaper had never been her aim. Her aim had been fidelity to color, fidelity to memory. But fidelity demanded a ledger of its own, one balanced with equal care for the living and the land. She returned to Jiao's yard and began to change. The work that had been purely aesthetic now wore the weight of ethics. She and Jiao set about making trials, smaller doses of mineral pigment, layered over a base of plant dye to stretch color farther. Binding agents that increased light fastness without more ore. Methods that used powdered shells, lapidary grinding of waste rock, and reclaimed pigments from chance salvage. They experimented with fermentation, the old southern trick that coaxed pigment from the seaweed's guts and brought from it a blue tempered by salt. In one of the yard's wide earthen basins, they boiled rice water with kelp, watching the broth thicken, and the surface break to a slow skin like living lacquer. The first attempts were failures of a kind that taught them faster than success. Colors came out muddy, then ghostly, then undertoned in a way that pulled at Mei Lin like a missing tooth. The shape was there, but the shine had been filed away. She fretted over every brushstroke, learning the arithmetic of loss, how much less blue would be required if a base of fermented starch amplified it. How many layers could be laid before the work lost the immediacy she needed to reach an emperor's memory? Jiao told her a story one afternoon as they rinsed the pots. It was a parable of two bowls, one rimmed with the richest lapis, the other a pale but true indigo gained from pooled seaweed. The first bowl dazzled and was admired, then placed in a glass cabinet and forgotten until the glass fogged with age. The second bowl sat on a table and was used to feed children, and its color faded in the light of use. But its story lived on in the hands that warmed their bread. There is honor in both, Jiao said, but the bowls earned their honor differently. Mei Lin began to think of a new aesthetic, one that embraced muted glazes as testimony rather than theft. She remembered the line her grandmother had taught her about a good painting, not how bright, but how true, and set herself to make truth mean something other than spectacle. She taught apprentice Xun and the older women who came to help to grind pigments finer, to layer washes thinly, to use ash and plant tannins to stabilize colors and create depth from paler dyes. They relearned the patience of low-fire glazes and the art of letting the surface itself hold memory. When scholar Lai Wei arrived with reams of brittle receipts and ordnance, the new direction became more than aesthetic. It became argument and testimony. He unfurled scrolls that showed the empire's permits for extraction, the clauses that had allowed merchants to take whole stretches of coastline in exchange for tribute, and the edicts that had outlawed southern ateliers under the guise of uniformity. He read passages aloud, his voice a calm blade cutting through Jiao's rawness. Statecraft has always used art as armor, and as target, Lai Wei told them. There are policies that do not merely command beauty, they appropriate it. The record is clear. The southern workshops were seen as a cultural threat. Their pigments were banned not because of any virtue, but because their origins told stories separate from the courts. To return to them is also to remember the violence done. Mei Lin folded her fingers around one of the scrolls. The linen was soft as moth wing. If we choose to diminish color, she whispered, do we not also diminish the chance to wake him? Perhaps, Li Wei said. But art without a viable world to contain it is only a funeral ornament. The question you face is whether your craft will be the last echo of a vanished thing, or the first word in a new story. It was an argument that tasted like a brass coin, cold, hard, impossible to swallow whole. Mei Lin thought of the emperor's eyes when he had seen the restored swallows bright, then gone, and of the three girls in Jiao's lost village. She thought of the women in temple kilns who still recited recipes like prayers, mouths set in the stubborn way of those who keep memory against erasure. There was, she realized, a moral geometry here that demanded sacrifice, but not at the cost of life. If beauty required blood, then she would seek beauty that asked only for breath. So they pursued restraint. Where once they had slaked a kiln with a handful of ore, they began to grind nobly from scraps, to use oxidized filings from old jewelry, to reconstitute pigments from recovered fragments. Mei Lin developed a method of layering, a faint underwash of plant dye to catch light, a whisper of mineral on top to signal blue, and repeated glaze that built depth without raw consumption. They taught apprentices how to coax intensity from texture the way a thin stitch of vermilion could appear brighter against a gray ground, because the eye met it like a surprise. The results were not immediate miracles. The colors were less brazen. They held a kind of dim pleasure, like a candle in fog. Mei Lin found herself adjusting compositionally, asking less of the pigments and more of the scene. She painted memories not as luminous tableaux, but as fragments, palimpsests of loss and repair. Her swallows came back as feathered suggestions. The peony's red was the memory of a red rather than its full bloom. When she showed the samples to Consort Lion, the woman's hand shook and she pressed one to her breast as if holding a small, salvaged heart. "They are honest," Lion said. "They look like things that have lived." The change brought them something crucial, the ability to keep working. Jiao slept better in the nights that followed. His shoulders, which had been a map of sorrow, loosened a notch. Marina began to bring them less or but more knowledge of foraging, a shell that ground to an ivory glaze, a species of algae that, when boiled long, stilled the flaking of pigment under heat. Scholar Wei wrote a short memorandum advocating the inclusion of certain plant dyes as court-sanctioned ritual colors, arguing that a codified scarcity could undercut the merchants who profited from extraction. But the cost of this new honesty was clear as well. The less brilliant palette made Mei Lin uneasy about her ability to reach the emperor. He responded to vividness. He had woken, however briefly, at the shock of lapis. If she could not reproduce that shock, would her work merely comfort the courtiers without touching the fragile center whose name she sought to call back? The moral calculus had shifted. She would trade the immediate chance of a blinding revival for the long-term chance that the craft might endure without eating the world. It felt like choosing the survival of a seed over the bloom of a single flower. On the evening the first batch of conservation glazes dried, Mei Lin walked the harbor alone. The sky was the color of pewter varnish. Gulls tucked themselves against the wind. She thought of her grandmother, of the lullabies that encoded recipes in nonsense verse, and of the southern Etelier's laughter that had once been a bell in a room now closed. She pressed her thumb to the edge of a test swatch, its color not the blue of empire, but a sea gray with a memory of blue inside. It was beautiful in the way of things that had lived too close to hurt, not dazzling but true. Behind her, apprenticed son came running along the quay, clutching a painted fan he'd worked on in secret. The fan's red seal had been revived with a hurried stroke of crimson that begged to be brighter than the modest glaze would allow. Son's eyes were wild with the kind of impatience that has both the innocence of youth and the capacity to ruin carefully laid plans.
"Teacher!"
"Look!" he cried, breathless in the harbor air.
"I made it look! I made it into color! They will see!
They will remember!" Mei Lin turned, the swatch catching the last light in her palm. For a heartbeat she saw the future in one of two ways, a slow patient arc of cautious teaching and quiet recoveries, or a leap that might awaken the emperor at the cost of others. Sun held the fan up high, its crimson shout against the salt gray. She took the fan from him gently and felt the haste in the brushwork. There was love in the strokes, and there was reckless hunger. "You must not show this yet," she said, and the firmness in her voice surprised them both. "Not in the market, not in the square. It is a promise we must keep with care. If men see brilliance once and demand it, they will not ask how it was paid for." Sun's mouth fell open with the sort of hurt that bakes to stubbornness. He looked toward the city as if he might run there and shout the fan's color like a bell. Mei Lin saw, in his young face, the reflection of every artisan who had thought the world owed them recognition. She pictured Jia's lost village, the cracked bowl, and the three girls. She pictured the emperor's bright eyes and the hush after. The harbor wind took her hair, and the fan fluttered in her hand like a living thing. "We will teach you to make color that does not take from a human life," she told Sun. "We will teach you to make it that lasts. But you cannot be the first to throw it into the square." "Not yet," he nodded, a small, wounded motion. In the dusk they walked back toward the kiln, carrying the fan and a new, delicate intention, beauty with a ledger, color made with consent and care. The decision would make their work quieter and slower. It would also give them something that the court's merchants could never buy: integrity. As they entered the yard, Mei Lin did not know whether the Grand Secretary would see such restraint as weakness or complication. She did not know whether a diminished blue could still reach the emperor's memory. She only knew that the alternative brilliance paid in blood and barren fields was a price she could not accept. The harbor bell tolled somewhere in the night, thick and sonorous. It was a sound that had once marked the opening of a festival and now marked the closing of a chapter. Mei Lin looked at the kiln's mouth, at the small glowing heart of their work, and felt the old ache of a line half sung. She would not, she decided, end the story with a single glorious note. She would learn how to arrange a chorus. Behind her, in the darker edge of the yard, apprentice Sun watched the fan's red settle into his palm. In the corner of his eye a plan began to lift like breath. It was small and dangerous, and it would lead him to make a choice that neither Mei Lin nor Jiao had wished for. The ember of urgency that had pushed him toward recognition would not be so easily snuffed. For now, it was only a suspicion, a shadow at the edge of their renewed resolve. But shadows have a way of stepping forward. Mei Lin laid the fan back into its paper wrap and began to prepare notes for the next day, recipes altered to save life and land. Lists of plants to ask the temple women for, a ledger of every scrap saved from the last purge. She wrote as her grandmother had taught her, names paired with memory, ingredients paired with story. Each line was a small vow. When she closed her journal that night, the word she wrote last was not victory but care. It was not a triumphal cry. It was a hand extended, steady and warm. The world had faded under empire and greed. Color would not return by violence. If it returned at all, it would be as a slow reclaiming, a tapestry mended stitch by patient stitch. Her choice had been made. The consequences would follow. The only certainty was that beauty, once chosen to be ethical, changed how the world had to be tended. And somewhere beyond the kiln, in the hush of the city, a courier brokered a rumor and a glove was placed on a door. The Grand Secretary's edicts moved like winter wind. The next disturbances were not far. Mei Lin blew out the lamp and listened for the sea. It answered with a single, patient tide. The sun that morning was a hard coin, a pale thing pressed into the narrowness between tiled roofs, and the banners that still clung to their last thread of color. Market cries braided with the rattle of a cartwheel and the clink of a tea bowl. Mei Lin had taught Sun to listen to light, how it picked up pigment, how a hue could be coaxed back from sleeping awe, but she did not teach him to hunger for applause. He had gone out before dawn with a bundle tucked inside his robe, his palms sticky with gum and his head full of the small rehearsed incantations Mei Lin used when she quieted a pigment into place: breath, patience, the slow arc of the wrist. He carried the scholar's fan with him, the one gifted years earlier to Madame Rui, the teacher who took enchanters and taught children their characters, whose life had been an ordering of paper and needle and scraps of rhyme. The fan had belonged to a man who once wrote verses under plum trees. Its painted lattice had faded to ash, the vermilion rose a memory that had leached away with the empire's fortunes. Sun thought of Mei Lin's soft voice in the studio. The margin notes she had made in his first copybook observed the patient breath she had written and of the quickness that lay like a shard in his chest, the desire to make the world laugh, to see faces unclouded by the pallor that had set upon them like ash. He thought also of the apprentices' faces in the alley, furtive, eager, hungry for recognition. To them, a single public miracle might be a way out of obscurity. The square where Madame Rue taught was no grand courtyard. It was an open patch near the market where taro sellers and silk menders crossed paths, where banners once hung in defiant scarlet and now sulked in the subdued light. Sun arrived under a sky strung with gulls and the tang of salt from the river. He had rehearsed the motions until his hands knew the menu: open the fan, lay the mount on a low table, set water and a coarse brush. Dust a pinch of ground lapis from the packet Mei Lin had tucked in his sleeve. When he worked, he moved like someone listening through the body. The crowd gathered first as a trickle, two children trailing a dog, a woman balancing a tray of fried cakes. A pair of elders who came to argue about the day's news. Sun heard someone say his name, half pride, half curiosity, and felt a warmth like a distant window opening. He hesitated only when a shadow crossed the table, Inspector Zhao, the man with the hawk face, whose neat robes always seemed to sit slightly too clean against his skin. Sun remembered the way Mei Lin lowered her voice when she spoke of officials. He felt the stitch of fear, but the knot in his throat would not loosen. Keep to the edges, Mei Lin had insisted in private. Do not make a forge where a market lives. Those words, like so many rules, had been broken not by malice but by a young hand that misread the smallness of the danger. He began with the most modest of gestures, the red of the outer petal, enough to suggest rebirth rather than a full return. The vermilion soaked into the silk. It drank like a thirsty bird. The fan brightened in the crowded light as if a hush had been lifted. The painted petals seemed to breathe. Madame Rui, who had long ago learned how to limit her expression in the face of loss, let out a sound that trembled between a laugh and a sob. A child clapped, an old man spat, and then, against his habit, smiled. Such small things spread. A woman near the front unfolded a cloth, showing a faded apron she still mended. Another man hummed a tune that had not been heard in months. A woman who sold jeweled hairpins pinched the corner of her mouth as she whispered, "It is like a morning." Sun's chest went taut with a vanity he could not stifle. People were naming color as if it were the return of a person. From the edge of the crowd, Inspector Zhao's gaze tightened. He did not move at first. He watched, and in watching he folded the scene into a ledger. The square's latter traveled only so far before rumor took it and sharpened it. A painter had restored a scholar's fan. A boy with bright hands had made color bloom. A man named Lai from the tea stall came forward, eager to praise the work and eager, too, to be seen praising what others viewed as an incitement of memory. "Where did you learn to make such color?" he asked, not with suspicion but with the merchant's hunger for novelty. His question hung like a bell. Sun named the sun and made a joke that landed thinly. His fingers betrayed him, smudged with the blue that had once slept in a southern mine. Someone in the crowd leaned closer and squinted. "Is this the same hand that paints at the northern court?" Another voice supplied. Another pair of eyes hardened. Inspector Zhao stepped forward then, an authoritative foot in a place where stories began to gather shape. He asked for identification with the ceremonial softness of a man who had practiced courtesy until it could win whatever he wished. "The studio that works for the temple," Sun stammered. "We Mei Lin, her apprentice." The name was a shard of glass. It ricocheted outward through the crowd. The vendor of mooncakes choked on his own business and covered his mouth, but the damage had been done. A barber who trimmed a minor official's hair walked away saying, "That is the painter the palace uses." At the far edge of the square, a clerk who knew men in higher places smoothed his sleeve and began to whisper the route, by which news came to the ears of those who held strings. Inspector Zhou made a polite note and left with the air of a man who carries small histories back to a larger ledger. He did not shout, he did not strike. That would have been clumsy. He walked as a man who knew the power of quiet objects in an empire that feared images. But his patrol would talk. His ledger would be seen. The name Mei Lin, which had been a hush in a studio, was now a mark. Sun returned to the studio in the afternoon with a heart that felt as if someone had trapped it in a drum. When he opened the door, Mei Lin looked up from a scroll she had been repairing. Her eyes catalogued him at once, the blue at his wrists, the grin that would not be contained, and then, with a small, contained movement, she lifted one hand as if to still him. "Where did you go?" she asked simply. Sun burst into a flood of explanation and apology, words tilting like water. He spoke of Madame Rui, of the cheer of the faces, of how people had wept with delight. He said he had thought to show the world that color could return. He told her about Inspector Zhao and how the crowd had named her. When he finished, the studio was very quiet. The rafters seemed to crouch closer. Mei Lin's face read like a study in ash and something else. She had expected mistakes. Apprentices would be apprentices, but she had not expected exposure so soon. She reached out and took Sun's paint-stained hand as if it were a fragile thing. "You did not listen to the edge of danger," she said. "You did not listen to the weight in your own chest. Art is a theft if it takes what belonged to others without paying its price." Her voice was not cruel. It was, in its own way, the most devastating curse, a statement of simple, unavoidable truth. "They cheered," Sun said. "I thought you could hold applause and secrecy at once." Mei Lin finished. "You cannot." She did not know then the full breadth of what folly would cost. Inspector Zhao had not needed to march with soldiers. He had needed only the common mechanics of the court, a whispered name, a respectful report. Within a day the yeoman had sent an order. The courier Chen, who had been assigned to fetch a sealed jar from a docksman, was seized on a road out of the city. A loaded cart was stopped. A plain pot of ground mineral was found beneath straw and onion skins. Chen, when he was pulled from the cart and beaten until his mouth bled, named a route in a panic. A lane by a boat that had traded in ores last season, a midwife who had once been a kiln's helper, a man who had spoken of Mei Lin in a tavern. Sun, who had not meant anyone harm, learned quickly what fear could do to a tongue. His breath came shallow and quick in a low-windowed room of the Yemen. Hands on the table cuffed him in a way that made his wrists feel unreal. He had not been struck yet, but the threat was a shadow that moved like a blade. A small man in a lacquered cap leaned over him and placed a bowl of water on the table. The water trembled in his hands, and the heat of the interrogation crowded into his ears like the press of a crowd. "Names," the man said. "Tell us the courier, and perhaps the rest will be lenient." Sun's voice was already a thread. He thought of Mei Lin's calm face, of the way she had taken his hand and let him feel the scale of his error. He thought of Jiao and the stories of villages that had been shelled by raids for the sake of war. But the hand on his heart did not steady. In the Yemen the present was a bright hot thing, the future a fog. He gave a name no longer able to calculate the cost. They moved quickly. Soldiers and clerks followed the route Sun had named and found, at the second stop, Chen the porter with a jar. He was dragged in like a wet thing and put before the magistrate. Under the hammer of evidence, and with men who knew how to make confessions fold like paper, names traveled. A midwife in a peripheral village who had once been paid a large sum to ferry pigment was taken in the night. The network, woven across docks and kilns and the quiet corners of the city, frayed at its first tug. Mei Lin heard the news like a wet bell. Eunuch Rong came at dusk to the studio with eyes that had been forced to look at too many faces. He spoke low and quickly. "They have a courier. They have other names. Keep nothing here." "Burn it?" Sun asked. "Scatter it," Mei Lin said. She meant more than the physical recipes. The move would be to scatter apprentices to safe houses, to move the last jars of ground or to Jiao's hidden kiln, to smear and dilute traces so they could not be easily traced by the inspector's sniffers, to get Madame Ru and others with ties to the work out of public view for a season. They worked through the night, 2 beats of a small heart. Mei Lin wrapped pigment jars in oilcloth and tucked them into parcels that smelled of tea and ginger. She carved out false ledger entries and fed them to scholarly Wei by a furtive messenger. Sun packed the fan his reckless charm, now a bruise on his soul, and sat with his head in his hands. Mei Lin made him sit across from her and look at the way the light came through the window. "You must learn to keep corners," she said, "to know which edges will cut and which will not. You must also learn to keep names in your mouth like a foreign fruit until you have a place to spit." He nodded, too ashamed to talk of fear. The shame lay like a salt stain across his tongue. In the days that followed, the magistrate's men did not stop with couriers. They spoke to merchants. They inspected kiln permits. They sat in tea-houses and took notes on those who used certain stones in the grinding. Men with clean robes came to the edges of the workshops and asked in voices that suggested they merely sought to learn. Jiao, who lived further from the center, disappeared for 3 nights and returned with his hands smelling of bay leaves and smoke. He had found a place that would hide jars in the body of a ship bound for a small island